So this video might be a little bit on the longer side because when I decided to cover all 36 Senate elections in 2022 and do it all in 2 videos, it originally sounded like a good idea to split them in half and do the least interesting 18 first. But now I've saved all of the interesting ones for this video. Considering the last one was like 20 minutes long, just get ready. I'll try to put some chapter markers if you want to skip ahead. Also, these are editing nightmares. I have made several mistakes in the last one, including one very specific and somewhat common Final Cut Pro glitch, where for some reason the software deletes every single character in my text box except the first one. For example, I had a graphic about Themis Clarides in the Connecticut Senate election, but instead it just displayed her name as T. I caught a couple of them before I exported last week, but I still missed a few. We're gonna try to do it with no mistakes this time, but I'm sure that if I do make them, someone will point them out in the comments. Anyway, this is the interesting half of the 36 Senate elections this year. Let's start with the remaining safe races that I didn't include in the last video because there is something interesting about them. And we begin with Iowa. It was tough picking whether I was going to do this one or Vermont in last week's video, and I think I made the wrong choice. There was some speculation on whether 89-year-old incumbent Republican Senator Chuck Grassley would retire and spend his final years enjoying some Dairy Queen. Also, don't know how the hell he's so healthy looking at 89, given the fact that he eats Dairy Queen so much. But anyway, unlike all the other senators his age who retired, he's running for an 8th term. He had a somewhat notable primary challenger from State Senator Jim Carlin, but still won the nomination with 73.5% of the vote. The Democratic primary had 3 candidates, but the favorite appeared to be former U.S. Representative Abby Finkenauer. She's a whole 55 years younger than Grassley, and that was like her main message. You know, she talked negatively about him staying in politics too long. But she never got to take that message into the general election campaign, because on primary day, retired Vice Admiral Michael Franken pulled off an upset victory, winning 55.2% of the vote and carrying 76 of Iowa's 99 counties. So the election is Chuck Grassley versus Michael Franken. I could have sworn that somebody originally rated this race likely Republican, and that like because Grassley's so old, people were saying it would be like marginally closer than all of his other millions of races before. And Franken's a decent candidate, or so he appeared to be. Now he's got some like sexual assault scandals going on. So yeah, Politico rates this race solid Republican. Next is Alabama, which was interesting because of the primary, given that the race is solid Republican. Incumbent Republican Senator Richard Shelby is retiring after 6 terms. The Democratic primary had 3 unknown candidates, and Pastor Will Boyd won with 63.7% of the vote. The Republican primary was the most chaotic all year, besides maybe Missouri, but we'll talk about that later. Of the 6 candidates that ran, it was pretty obvious that a runoff was inevitable, with the main 3 candidates being Richard Shelby's former Chief of Staff Katie Britt, businessman and former Army pilot Mike Durant, and U.S. Representative Mo Brooks. Brooks originally looked like a strong candidate and was endorsed by Donald Trump. But when his poll number started to slip, Trump rescinded his endorsement, which is, as far as I know, the only time he's done that this entire election cycle. He called Brooks woke for like not talking about the 2020 election more, which is just like weird. It seems like a Trump endorsed candidate like can't talk about their own issues or have a different platform other than 2020 election stolen. Britt outperformed every single one of her polls, winning 44.7% of the vote in the first round and carrying 62 counties as well. But Brooks still got 29.2% of the vote and carried the other 5 counties, most importantly holding Britt under 50% and forcing a runoff. In the 4 weeks in between the primary and the runoff, Trump decided he was going to make another endorsement, and there was some speculation on whether he would re-endorse Brooks. But he ended up endorsing Britt, who won the runoff with 63% of the vote and carried all but 1 county. So the election is Katie Britt versus Will Boyd. This will almost certainly be the first time Alabama has ever elected a female senator. The following 2 races are most interesting because their primaries are just done completely differently than every other state. So our 3rd race is Louisiana. Incumbent Republican Senator John Neely Kennedy is running for a 2nd term. When I said the primary was interesting, I'm lying a little bit, because unlike every other state, Louisiana has no primaries. Sort of. Basically, on November 8th, or whenever the general election is, all candidates appear on the same ballot. If any candidate gets a majority, it's over. But if no one does, the top 2 candidates advance to a runoff 32 days later. There's 13 candidates in this race made up of 2 Republicans, 5 Democrats, 5 Independents, and 1 Libertarian. Based on polling, though, it appears that the top 3 candidates are activist Gary Chambers, U.S. Navy veteran Luke Mixon, and of course, incumbent Senator John Kennedy. I was conflicted on whether to make this video because I could have taken the chance and waited till after November 8th to make it. But that would only work if Kennedy didn't get a majority of the vote in the first round. It's really up in the air whether he does. The 2 polls have him at 52% and 51%, but yeah, I'm pretty sure he will. So the race is John Kennedy versus Gary Chambers versus Luke Mixon. Politico rates this race solid Republican. And finally, our last solid race of this cycle is in Alaska, another state with a really weird primary, although their system is very new. In 2020, Alaskan voters approved a ballot measure which changed the primary system from a traditional 2-party primary to this weird, unique top 4 primary, where all candidates appear on the same primary ballot ballot, and the top 4 advanced to a ranked choice general election. Incumbent Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski was first appointed by her father in 2002 and is now running for a 4th full term. The 19-candidate field comprised 8 Republicans, 3 Democrats, 5 independents, and 3 third-party candidates. You might be wondering why there's so many Republican candidates even though the incumbent is also a Republican. The answer probably lies in the fact that Murkowski voted to convict Trump in his second impeachment trial back in February 2021. So a month later, the Alaska GOP censured her and vowed to recruit a Republican challenger. 4 months later, they endorsed former Alaska Department of Administration Commissioner Kelly Tshibaka. Murkowski placed first in the primary, winning 45% of the vote, and Tshibaka finished second, winning 38.6%. Meanwhile, of the 3 Democratic candidates, the Alaska Democratic Party endorsed teacher Pat Chesbrough, and she got third with just 6.8% of the vote. After that, it was really a toss-up as to who would take 4th place. It ended up being retired mechanic Buzz Kelly, who got 2.1% of the vote. Like Tshibaka, he was also running to the right of Murkowski, but out of fear of splitting the vote, he dropped out on September 13th and endorsed Tshibaka. Alaska mainly divides results by state house districts because they don't have counties, and Murkowski won 28 of those while Tshibaka won the other 12. So the election is Lisa Murkowski versus Kelly Tshibaka versus Pat Chesbrough. Politico rates this race solid Republican, but there's not much consensus on which Republican that'll be. Politico, like 3 other news organizations, thinks it'll be Murkowski, but the poll analysts at 538 think it'll be Tshibaka. After what happened with Mary Peltola winning the special election for the House, I have this weird gut feeling that Tshibaka is gonna win by like this very small margin. Okay, now we get to the likely races, where there's an incumbent and then there's an underdog, and it's not totally out of the realm of possibility that the underdog will win, but it's very unlikely. The first of these elections is in Washington. Incumbent Democratic Senator Patty Murray is running for a 6th term. Fun fact, I actually saw her at the restaurant I was eating at the other night. So at least we know she has good taste in food. Oh, but guess what? We got another weird primary system. Washington does it the same way that California does, where all candidates appear on the same primary ballot and the top 2 finishers, regardless of party, advance to the general election. There were 18 candidates, including 6 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and 9 third-party candidates and independents. As you'd expect for an incumbent, Murray was obviously going to get first, so it really became about who would come in second. But that wasn't much of a competition either, because over a year ago, the state GOP endorsed Nurse Tiffany Smiley. Now, the fact that all candidates run together in the same primary offers some insight that other states' primaries don't. The only time Murray ever faced a close race for re-election was in 2010, which is also Murray's only re-election campaign where she didn't win a majority of the vote in the primary. But Murray won this primary with 54.2% of the vote, and carried 16 of the state's 39 counties, mostly in the very populated western part of the state. Smiley came in second with 33.6% and carried the other 23 counties. So the election is Patty Murray versus Tiffany Smiley. Politico rates this race likely Democratic. But if you total up every vote cast for a Democrat or Republican in the primary, 57.3% of them went to a Democrat, so this race is probably out of the question for the GOP. The Republicans haven't won a Senate race in Washington since the 1990s, and it's just very, very unlikely, even in like a 2014 style red wave, which is pretty clear by now that this year is not going to be anything like that. I'm sure a lot of you guys know about the Marcus Flowers House race. He's running against Marjorie Taylor Greene, and he has no chance, but he still managed to raise like $10 million from Resist Libs donating to him, thinking he has a chance for some reason. Well, the election in Kentucky is basically the Senate equivalent of that. Incumbent Republican Senator Rand Paul is running for a 3rd term. He faced 5 minor challengers in the Republican primary, but still won with 86.3% of the vote. In the Democratic primary, former state representative Charles Booker returned for another go after losing a close primary in 2020 in the race to challenge Mitch McConnell. But this time he was the clear favorite. He won 73.2% of the vote and 116 of Kentucky's 120 counties. So the election is Rand Paul versus Charles Booker. Politico rates this race likely Republican, but if Booker somehow manages to pull off an upset, he would be the 2nd US senator with the last name Booker, which is funny because the other Booker endorsed him. I'm not denying that Booker is a good candidate, and for Kentucky, where Democrats don't really have that much of a chance on the federal level, he's one of the best recruits Democrats could have hoped for. And he's raised a ton of money, but it just probably won't go far. He's had some really good ads and good candidate outreach, but again, most of the donations are from Resist Libs out of state who are like, we need to unseat Rand Paul, and then they donate to Charles Booker instead of donating to candidates in winnable races. Rand Paul seems very confident in his re-election chances. I haven't seen him tweet about Charles Booker a single time. I don't even know if they're debating, which, is pretty common. Anyway, let's talk about Missouri. This one was my longest TikTok about any election ever. It was like 1.5 minutes long. Incumbent Republican Senator Roy Blunt is retiring after 2 terms. This election was interesting because neither primary had a clear winner going into primary day. This election also holds the distinction of having the most candidates, at least of any Senate election, because I think the Oregon gubernatorial election had more. There were 11 Democratic candidates, but the main 2 were attorney Lucas Kuntz and former nurse Trudy Busch Valentine. Valentine won with 43.2% of the vote and carried 73 of the state's 115 county equivalents. Meanwhile, there were 21 Republican candidates. The original frontrunner was infamous former Governor Eric Greitens, who resigned less than a year and a half into his his first term because of numerous scandals, most notably sexual assault allegations. And the allegations only got worse as he campaigned for the Senate. Missouri's other senator, Josh Hawley, who by the way was Attorney General when Greitens was governor, had some not so nice things to say about him. Greitens didn't really help his image, and most notably he released a very ridiculous ad called Rhino Hunting. Rhino standing for Republican in name only, in case you didn't know. It was a play on words because it was like rhino hunting as in the animal, but really in politics it would mean, oh yeah, I'm gonna shoot Republicans who aren't real Republicans or something. I don't know what the message he was trying to get across was. And it's also funny because he was a Democrat like 7 years ago. Like, bro, Luckily, there were plenty of other high-profile candidates. They included 2 of Missouri's 8 U.S. representatives and State Attorney General Eric Schmitt. This video wouldn't be complete if I didn't mention the fact that Trump simply endorsed Eric. There were people on Twitter joking that that was what he was gonna do, and I cannot believe he actually did that. Honestly, it's a contender for funniest thing Trump has ever done. And it was even funnier that both Erics claimed the endorsement. Eric Schmitt made a comeback and won with 45.7% of the vote and carried 92 county equivalents. So the election is Eric Schmitt versus Trudy Busch Valentine. Politico rates this race likely Republican, and if Schmitt wins, it would make Missouri the only state where both of its senators are former state attorneys general. Okay, now we reach Utah, which is basically a category of its own. Incumbent Republican Senator Mike Lee is running for a 3rd term. He faced a somewhat credible primary challenge from former state representative Becky Edwards, but he still won with 61.9% of the vote. And here's where it gets weird. The only Democrat that filed to run was diplomat Cale Weston, and he was probably like, oh, nice, I got the Democratic nomination uncontested, like, that's so lucky, right? Even though I have no chance of winning, like, I'll still get my picture on the Wikipedia page and everything, but no. So for context, in 2016, former CIA operations officer Evan McMullen, I've been on Twitter too much, ran for president as an independent and received 21.5% of the vote in Utah, which is a better finish in any state than all but one independent presidential candidate in the last half century. He announced in October 2021 that he was running for this seat, and with such a credible third-party candidate, Democrats feared that they would split the vote and make it even more easy for the GOP to win in a deep red state like Utah, where it's already basically guaranteed. So at the state Democratic convention on April 23rd, they voted to drop out of the race completely and endorse Evan McMullen. It was close, but they kicked Weston off the ballot and made this the first Senate election in Utah history with no Democratic nominee. This was a pretty self-sacrificial move on their part because McMullen is not exactly anywhere close to a Democrat, and he promised not to caucus with or associate with, in layman terms, with either party if elected, which would be unlike the other 2 independent senators Angus King and Bernie Sanders, who both caucus with the Democrats. So the election is Mike Lee versus Evan McMullen. Politico rates this race likely Republican. And even without a Democrat in the race, it seems unlikely that McMullen will be able to attract the same support as he did in 2016 without Trump on the ballot. But I like to think that there's some weird universe where the Republicans win 50 seats, the Democrats win 49, and Evan McMullen wins this race, and basically becomes the most powerful man in the country for like 2 years. Because with basically every single Senate bill, he would be the deciding vote. Move over, Joe Manchin. Okay, now we get to the close-ish Senate races. These elections all have a candidate who is favored and a candidate who is not, but it wouldn't be the biggest surprise in the world if the candidate who isn't favored won, although it would still be considered an upset. We begin with Florida, where incumbent Republican Senator Marco Rubio is running for a 3rd term. Kind of similar to Rand Paul, Rubio has also advocated for term limits, but is running for a 3rd term anyways. And he had no primary opposition. The Democratic primary wasn't very interesting either. There were 4 candidates, but it was obvious that the winner would be U.S. Representative Val Demings. In the primary, she got 84.3% of the vote and carried 65 of the state's 67 counties. So the election is Marco Rubio versus Val Demings. Now, Florida's been trending Republican in recent years, and there's no denying that this race is an uphill battle for Demings. But she's definitely putting up one hell of a fight. She's releasing ads leaning on her experience as chief of the Orlando Police Department, because, you know, defund the police is so 2020, and that's out now. Now we're all about the police again. Demings has also raised like over $50 million, which, as a person who thinks like utilitarian-wise, there's so many better uses for that money. But because of these factors, Politico changed this race from likely to lean Republican. Demings was on the shortlist to become Biden's running mate in 2020, and if she wins, which is a big if, she would probably, actually very likely be a vice presidential candidate in some election in the future. Next is New Hampshire, which, unless you count Louisiana not having a primary, technically this was the last primary of the year. Incumbent Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan is running for a 2nd term. Wow, her last name sounds so familiar. You know what's ironic is that people seem to know how to pronounce her name, even though it's spelled with an A, they pronounce it Hassan, which is the same as my last name. But for some reason, half the people that read my name with an E at the end still pronounce it Hassan. Anyway, Hassan had 2 primary challengers and easily won with 94.3% of the vote. The Republicans had 11 candidates, but the primary followed the same course we've seen like so many times this year. That was really funny, wasn't it? People laughing outside clearly think I'm hilarious. I didn't even get to the punchline yet. Even though there's not really a punchline, it's a little difficult to make politics funny sometimes. Because if you do, everyone's like, oh my god, politics is life or death. OMG, you're literally canceled. So anyway, Republicans really tried to get incumbent Governor Chris Sununu to run for the seat. Unlike most Republican governors that the GOP tried to get to run for the Senate, he actually considered it, but ended up deciding against it. But one of his closest political allies, State Senate President Chuck Morse, did run. I'm sure he had really high name recognition from his 2 days where he was governor of New Hampshire, in between Hassan and Sununu, and he was the moderate candidate. But of course you had your Trump-aligned candidate, in this case retired Army General Don Bolduc. He was a particularly special case. On one hand, he was a pretty typical Trump-aligned candidate saying the 2020 election was stolen and whatnot, but on the other hand, he also had some really outlandish comments like calling Governor Sununu a communist sympathizer. As the primary season continued and in state after state, Republicans picked the Trump-aligned candidates who would be weaker in general elections, the GOP realized, oh shit, we screwed up so many other elections, we need to avoid that in New Hampshire. So in like the last week of this race, they pushed really hard for Morse to win. Sununu even endorsed him 5 days before the primary. However, it proved to be too little too late. The primary was still close, but Bolduc won with 37.1% of the vote and carried 8 of New Hampshire's 10 counties. So the election is Maggie Hassan versus Don Bolduc. Politico rates this race lean Democratic, but I wouldn't be surprised if they changed it to likely Democratic. Okay, next is Ohio, which was the first Senate primary of the year. Incumbent Republican Senator Rob Portman decided to retire after 2 terms. Portman was relatively popular and a big fundraiser, so Democrats saw this as a decent opportunity, even in a state that's been trending Republican. 3 candidates ran, but the frontrunner was U.S. Representative Tim Ryan, who also apparently ran for president in 2020, and I think everybody in the world forgot about that. He won the nomination with 69.7% of the vote. Republicans had 7 candidates, but by the end, the main 3 were State Senator Matt Dolan, author J.D. Vance, and former Ohio State Treasurer Josh Mandela. Polling was all over the place, and at one point, even the person who eventually finished 4th was shown to be in 1st. But Vance won with 32.2% of the vote and carried 74 of Ohio's 88 counties. So the race is J.D. Vance versus Tim Ryan. Ryan has been in the House for like 20 years, and he's a really good candidate. Unlike a lot of candidates from both parties this year, he's actually adapting to the electorate and is trying to paint himself as a conservative Democrat. Some people may disagree with that, but he's at least trying to paint himself as a moderate, even though he votes with Biden and Pelosi like almost 100% of the time, but he's still massively outraising Vance and campaigning way harder. Just like Florida, Politico changed this race from likely to lean Republican. Some people have changed this to toss-up, which is just ridiculous in my opinion. I've said it before, I'll say it again, Tim Ryan is not winning. It might be closer than people think, and maybe even than I think. Maybe if Trump had won re-election in 2020, then Ryan would have a better chance. But yeah, it looks like Vance has good odds to become the first millennial Republican in the Senate. Alright, let's do North Carolina. Incumbent Republican Senator Richard Burr is retiring after 3 terms. The race to replace him on the ballot attracted a lot of candidates. Of the 15 that ran for the Republican nomination, the main 3 were former U.S. Representative Mark Walker, former Governor Pat McCrory, and U.S. Representative Ted Budd. Not related to Tedward Bundy, once again. McCrory was originally the favorite, but he kind of got screwed by the North Carolina Supreme Court, because the primary was originally supposed to be March 8th, but they delayed it to May 17th. And McCrory led in polls up until March, and then Budd took the lead. And Budd won with 58.6% of the vote and carried 99 of North Carolina's 100 counties. The Democratic primary had several notable candidates, but as time went on, they all dropped out and endorsed former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court, Cheri Beasley. There were 11 candidates by the end, but Beasley won with 81.1% of the vote. So the election is Ted Budd versus Cheri Beasley. Politico has kept this race at lean Republican since the beginning. This election is kind of like Ohio's little sister, where people are way overestimating the Democratic nominee's chances of winning, but not to the same extent as Ohio. Okay, let's talk about Colorado. Incumbent Democratic Senator Michael Bennet was first appointed in 2009 and is now running for a 3rd full term. He ran unopposed for the Democratic nomination. Colorado has basically done the reverse of Florida, where it used to be a swing state but is now trending Democratic. But Republicans still have a little hope in this state. They elected a Republican senator as recently as 8 years ago, and Bennet only won by 5 points in 2016, so Republicans consider him potentially vulnerable. The Democrats wanted to quash this problem before it became, an actual problem, so they employed the same strategy that's been used in a ton of other races this year, which is of course to promote the more conservative Trump-aligned candidate in hopes that they'll win the primary and they'd be way easier to beat in the general election. In this election, that candidate was State Representative Ron Hanks. The state GOP thinned most of the other candidates, and the only other one that remained was business owner Joe O'Dea. And despite Democrats' best efforts, O'Dea won the primary with 54.5% of the vote and carried 26 of Colorado's 64 counties. Well, thanks a lot, Liberia. Of the 10 most competitive Senate races in 2022, this is the only one where the Trump-aligned candidate didn't win the Republican primary. So the election is Michael Bennet versus Joe O'Dea. Politico rates this race lean Democratic, but it seems like the hype behind O'Dea has kind of died out, and I wouldn't be surprised if they change it to likely Democratic. Alright, so I've been filming for about the last 75 years, and the sun set, so the lighting changed. So for the final 5 elections, I'm standing over here. Now let's take a look at Arizona. Incumbent Democratic Senator Mark Kelly was first elected in a 2020 special election and is now running for a full term. He got the Democratic nomination unopposed. Republicans tried to get term-limited Governor Doug Ducey to run, but he declined. But term-limited Attorney General Mark Brnovich did run. He originally appeared to be the frontrunner, but as time went on, it became clear that the winner would be either businessman Jim Lamone or venture capitalist Blake Masters, who was endorsed by Trump back in June. He won the nomination with 40.2% of the vote and carried 14 of Arizona's 15 counties. So the election is Mark Kelly versus Blake Masters. Masters pivoted hard after the primary, revising his stances on things like the 2020 election and abortion. But he's lagging in the polls and is being massively outspent by Kelly, so Politico changed this race from toss-up to lean Democratic. But Masters' former boss, billionaire and GOP megadonor Peter Thiel is jumping into the race and fundraising for Masters now. When Kelly won the special election 2 years ago, he was the first Democrat in 58 years to win the seat, and it remains to be seen whether he can do it again in a different political environment. But it wouldn't be a stretch to call him the favorite right now. The exact opposite of the election in Arizona might be the election in Wisconsin. Incumbent Republican Senator Ron Johnson pledged to only serve 2 terms, but is running for a 3rd term anyways. He had one primary challenger, but still easily won with 83.7% of the vote. There were 8 candidates for the Democratic nomination, and some of the notable ones included Wisconsin State Treasurer Sarah Godlewski, Milwaukee Bucks Vice President Alex Lasry, Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, and former Majority Leader of the Wisconsin Assembly Tim Nelson. According to polls, Barnes was always the clear favorite, but in a surprising twist, all 3 other major candidates dropped out of the primary in the same week and endorsed him, thus ensuring that he'd win even more easily, which he did, picking up 77.8% of the vote. So the election is Ron Johnson versus Mandela Barnes. The reason I said this was similar to Arizona is because you have an incumbent in a swing state, and the election was generally expected to be close before anybody knew who the candidates would be. And just like Arizona, the incumbent easily wins renomination, but the winner of the opposing party's primary is considered to be a little bit out of touch with the state's voters. Or at least that's how they're painting Barnes. I think he's a fairly decent candidate, but he's like pretty progressive. Johnson's not all that popular either, with only a 36% approval rating. But they're running ads about Barnes like, you know, typical, he doesn't care about crime because he wants to defund the police type of thing. Pretty much every poll recently has shown Johnson ahead, but Politico still rates this race as a toss-up. And now we get to the big 3. These are the closest races of the year, they get the most coverage, and one of them is most likely to decide control of the Senate, if it ends up being 50-50 or 51-49. Let's begin with Georgia. Incumbent Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock was also first elected in a special election in 2020, or I guess early 2021, and is now running for a full term. He got the Democratic nomination with 96% of the vote. The Republican primary had 6 candidates, including some who would traditionally do well, like Georgia Agriculture Commissioner Gary Black and former NSC Director of Intelligence Latham Sadler. But as we all know, and as I'm writing an article about in my school's Political Review magazine, ever since Trump was elected, establishment candidates have fallen out of favor, and these outsider populist types have become all the rage. This primary was no exception, and the clear frontrunner was former NFL player Herschel Walker, who was backed by Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell. He easily won the nomination with 68.2% of the vote. So the election is Raphael Warnock versus Herschel Walker, and Politico rates this race as a toss-up, but this has been one hell of a general election campaign. You know, there's some like domestic abuse allegations about Warnock floating around, but man, Republicans have been doing a pretty terrible job of, you know, making them part of the mainstream discussion about this election. Oh, and the more mainstream scandal, if you can even call it that, is his campaign finance violations. Whether or not they're true, the Democrats are doing a much better job making Walker look like the bad guy. Or actually, it's not even the Democrats. So Walker has his own domestic abuse allegations, but also it's becoming clear that Walker couldn't pull out of a driveway. So he's been all about how black fathers have been absent in the household, and that's like, you know, a problem. And then one by one it gets revealed that he has multiple secret children. He's also very anti-abortion, but it was revealed a few days ago that he paid a woman to get an abortion. Hypocrisy and politics go together like me and flags. Also, his son went on a Twitter rant about him the other day. I think that Politico will change this race to lean Democratic eventually, but within like 16 hours of the revelations about the abortion and Walker's son tweeting about him, there were people on Twitter doing what people on Twitter do best, which is being impulsive. They were like, OMG, Georgia Senate is literally likely Democratic. And I actually saw somebody do that. They were like, moving Georgia to likely Democratic. Okay, if the abortion stuff goes mainstream, yeah, I mean, like, it's not going to be as competitive as it would have been, but Walker's going to have to do a little bit more for this race race to be likely Democratic because it's Georgia. It's also just a terminally online take to think that Walker's son tweeting about him is going to have a significant influence on the electorate. There's very few people who were dead set on voting for Walker that are like, you know what? His son had some shit to say about him that I totally didn't already know, so I'm going to vote for Warnock now. That being said, I'm pretty confident right now in saying that Warnock will win. I don't know by how much, but yeah. Next, we have the quiet race in Nevada, which if I had to bet on any election being the make or break election for either party winning the Senate majority, it would be this one. Let's get into it. Incumbent Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto is running for a second term. She got the Democratic nomination with 90.8% of the vote. There were 8 candidates for the Republican nomination, but the main 2 were Army veteran Sam Brown and former Nevada Attorney General Adam Laxalt. This election was notable during the primary because Laxalt was bunkmates in the Navy with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and DeSantis flew out to Nevada to campaign for him, which at the time was the first time he'd ever done that. That was mostly because Laxalt was facing a decently credible challenge from Sam Brown, who, you know, most people expected Laxalt to easily win the nomination at the beginning. But in the end, he still came out on top, winning 55.7% of the vote and carrying 16 of Nevada's 17 county equivalents. So the election is Catherine Cortez Masto versus Adam Laxalt, and Politico rates this race as a toss-up. I consider the big 5 closest Senate elections to be those in Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Nevada. And believe it or not, we've strayed so far from the establishment that this is the only one of those 5 races where Republicans nominated a candidate that had any political experience. If Laxalt wins, he'd be the first Republican to hold this seat since his own grandfather in the 1980s. I would guess that this election won't be called until multiple days after November 8th. And finally, let's talk about Pennsylvania. This is my favorite election of the year, and this will not be the last time I talk about it on my YouTube channel. Incumbent Democratic Senator Pat Toomey is retiring after 2 terms. I meant to say Republican, by the way. 2 notable Democratic candidates included State Representative Malcolm Kenyatta and U.S. Representative Connor Lamb. However, neither looked like they had much of a chance at beating Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman. Just like Wisconsin, you got your progressive lieutenant governor, and Fetterman also ran for the seat in 2016, but didn't do that well. This time, though, he was the favorite and easily won the nomination with 58.6% of the vote. The Republican primary was pretty dramatic. For most of 2021, the frontrunner was U.S. Army veteran Sean Parnell, not to be confused with former Alaska Governor Sean Parnell. Same name. When these elections first started taking shape about a year ago, I was very confused why people were tweeting about a former governor of Alaska that left office 7 years before. I finally figured it out, and then like 3 days later, he dropped out of the race because of multiple scandals. After that, celebrity doctor Mehmet entered the race, which was controversial for a host of reasons, most notably that he'd only been a Pennsylvania resident and thus been eligible to vote in Pennsylvania for about a year. But Oz still needed to beat several other candidates, including the 2 most notable ones, author Kathy Barnett and businessman David McCormick. This was the closest primary of the year. It was so close it triggered an automatic recount, but after 17 days, McCormick finally conceded. Oz won by just 951 votes, or a margin of 0.07%. He was also 1 vote away from being exactly at 420,000 votes, which is really funny because weed number. Please like this video because funny weed number. He won 23 counties while McCormick won 37 and Barnett won the other 7. So the election is Mehmet Oz versus John Fetterman. Fetterman had a stroke a few days before the primary, so up until very recently, most of the campaigning had been done on Twitter. I would be very, very disappointed if I didn't do a Twitter inspection about it. I've been very busy lately, but like, that is the top episode I want to do because it's been so funny. Fetterman's gonna be in for a tough time on election night when he realizes that all of the out-of-state teenagers that like his tweets can't vote in Pennsylvania, but he really is good at being an edgelord, like really funny with the memes on Twitter. And Oz is just hilarious. He's running a decent campaign and like traveling all over the state. Recently, he's been accused of being a puppy killer, but in my opinion, his biggest scandal was the crudités video. It was a very bizarre video where he went to a store, called it Wegmans, even though it wasn't Wegmans, and picked out a bunch of random vegetables and called it a crudité and complained about how expensive it was because of Joe Biden's policies and inflation, and then said that price doesn't even include the tequila, even though nobody really eats veggie trays with tequila. It was very funny for a while, although I will say Fetterman is kind of pushing it. These days, Fetterman's entire campaign is literally Dr. Oz, New Jersey crudité. Politico rates this race as a toss-up. Oz hasn't led in a single poll, which people on Twitter will be quick to tell you every time people say Oz actually has a chance at winning. At one point, Fetterman was up by 21 points in this ridiculous poll, and it was around the time I made the TikTok about this election, so people were like, easy Fetterman W. Throughout 2022, it's been rated by different polling or news organizations anywhere from tilt Republican to likely Democratic. If Fetterman wins, he'd be the tallest elected senator in US history. And if Oz wins, he'd be the first ever Muslim senator. So that's it. These 36 elections will decide who controls the Senate between 2023 and 2025. Except not all of them, because very few of them are actually close. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure and go eat crudités in New Jersey. Top tier joke right there. So this video should get 20,000 likes.